Welcome back to part two of our video series, where we're talking about how does a Christian find joy in suffering, joy in trials, the kind that James talks about in chapter 1. So since the first video, I hope you've had time to really think about and prayerfully ask God about your level of trust with Him, because I believe that is just paramount to all of this. If you don't trust God, then the rest of this stuff isn't going to do a whole lot. It's just not going to be all that important. So I hope you've had time to really assess that, and I hope you had been able to really build your trust in God through that, and that you continue to do so. That is my prayer for you. So moving on, I think the next big key component that God has been teaching me about finding joy in suffering is the mindset that He wants Christians to have. Okay? Now, we know it's pretty common knowledge in psychology, self-help, and all that stuff, both Christian and secular nowadays, that it's really important for us to avoid negativity and focus on not necessarily positivity, neutrality, that kind of stuff, but avoiding negativity we know works, right? That's pretty common knowledge nowadays. Negative thoughts are going to happen. Negativity is around us. It's unavoidable. But when you're dwelling upon it, spending time, letting it fester, we know that is the enemy of joy. That's common knowledge nowadays. You can see it everywhere. Just do a couple Google searches. However, that is not a new concept. A couple thousand years ago, in Philippians 4:8, Paul said, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence, and if there is anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things." And then right before that, in the exact passage, that same passage, verses 4-7, Paul says things like, you should rejoice in the Lord, and don't worry about anything. And also, Jesus, in Matthew 6:25-34, says, don't worry about your life. Don't worry about your clothes, your food. And he goes into explanations, talking about how he cares about the birds. Very powerful stuff. But one kind of key takeaway from those three passages, did you notice they are spoken like a command? They're not, hey, you should probably try this. This might be a really good idea. No, they are spoken like a command. Don't worry about your life. Dwell on these things. Rejoice in the Lord. I don't hear any question marks there. I don't hear any maybes. It's do this. Now, obviously those things sound like the keys for living a joyous, happy life, no matter what's going on in your world, right? But how do we adopt these practices, since they're clearly important enough to be spoken as a command by Paul, Jesus, most importantly Jesus, right? So what God directed me to with this was Jesus' life as an example. All right, he gave us some clues just by his living, and there's references all through the Bible we can find on this. So let's start off with this first one. Now, I couldn't get a clear answer on this, but we know that Jesus quoted, referenced, or alluded to the scriptures many times, right? There's at least 27 Old Testament books that we know about. Keep in mind, the New Testament didn't exist when Jesus was around, right? We also know that just throughout the entire New Testament, the Old Testament is referenced or alluded to over 300 times, okay? So we know that Jesus and the early church knew the Bible. They clearly read it often. They clearly studied it, learned it. They spent time in the Bible. They knew the scriptures. They could speak it, okay? So hang on to that for a little bit. We'll move on to the next example that Jesus left us, which was his prayer life. In Luke 5:16, it's talking about all the large crowds following Jesus from all the healings and miracles he was working. And it says, yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. There are numerous other references too. There's Mark 1:35, Luke 4:42, Mark 6:46, Luke 6:12, Matthew 26:36-35, and chapter 6, verses 5-13. And that's just to name a few. That there's a lot more out there. You can definitely dig into it. Now, I'm not going to give an expose on how to pray or any of the important stuff like that. There's a ton of resources out there, and there are people who have it a lot more figured out than I do. But I will say this real quick, just in a nutshell. Prayer really is more about listening to and being with God. I'll leave it there. Now, it's clearly, if Jesus made that a huge priority in his life, so should we. Okay? Now, this stuff that I'm talking about here, spending time in the Bible, spending quality time in prayer alone with God, by yourself, no other humans, but in the presence of God, these are not a magic formula that I'm trying to get at or say, here's the steps you need to take, all right? But the point is, you notice there's a commonality between spending time in the Bible and spending time with God, listening to him in prayer. Being in the presence of God and allowing these things to infiltrate your life, allowing you to hear God, hear the Holy Spirit speaking to you. So in my mind, the things that God has been teaching me over the last really few months, probably for a lot longer than that, but we'll just key it in there. Trust God and get in his presence. Those are the main keys to finding joy when you're facing trials and suffering. Now look, those things are not going to take the problems away. Those things are not going to make your life easier. It may not make your life better necessarily, but there are things that happen when you trust God, allow him to have things his way, spend time in his Bible, letting that change your thinking, spending time in prayer and letting him take control of your life and you following him. There are things that happen that impact so much more than we can possibly understand. Think back to that story with Job. Again, one of the only reasons that I can see that he went through all that suffering was so that he and I could learn to trust God. But at the same time, think about how many millions and millions of people are learning that lesson because Job went through that suffering. Is it worth it? I think so. So there is a purpose in your suffering. Trust God that there is that purpose. Spend time with him and he will give you strength. And make those things a priority in life. At some point, probably sooner rather than later, joy will begin to start entering your life. And you'll be able to start living your purpose and seeing your purpose and knowing that you have a purpose in God, through God. And you will have an impact in his kingdom because of it. Thank you guys so much for your time.